A king walked into a corridor and never came out alive. This is not folklore, it's history. The tragic, unbelievable death of King Charles VIII of France, a monarch undone not by war or conspiracy, but by the weight of his own fate. Before that fatal step beneath a low stone arch, Charles was a dreamer, a king who sought to turn France into an empire and himself into a legend. Charles VIII was born here in 1470 at the royal chateau of Ambos, the very place he would one day die. He entered the world as the fragile heir of Louis XI, the Spider King, a man feared for his cunning, his paranoia, and his endless political schemes. Louis XI ruled through manipulation, weaving webs of alliances and betrayal that brought feudal France to heel. He had united the kingdom, but through fear, not love. When he died in 1483, the crown passed to his only surviving son. Charles was just 13 years old, shy, small, and utterly unprepared to rule. Too young to command, too naive for politics, Charles became a puppet to those around him. His sister, Anne of France, took control as regent, and she ruled with her iron hand hidden in velvet. She protected her brother, but she also murdered him. Under her shadow, Charles learned that knightship was a fragile illusion, a crown balanced on fear and loyalty. The court was divided, nobles on one side, clerics on the other. Each whispered their ambitions. And at the center, a teenage king who still believed the knights could win glory and the queens could bring peace. He was gentle, almost too gentle for the throne. Historians will later call him Charles the Affable, kind-hearted, trusting, and tragically unaware of the world's cruelty. By his 20s, Charles had grown into his role. He was determined to lead not as his father had, through deceit, but as a true knight, guided by honor and faith. His court became a reflection of chivalric ideals, tournaments, feasts, poetry, and pageantry. He restored France's image of nobility after decades of intrigue. At his side was his queen, Anne of Brittany, intelligent, proud, and devoted. Their union was more than love, it was destiny. By marrying Anne, Charles brought Brittany, the last semi-independent duchy, under French control, finally united France under one crown. It was the kind of victory he loved, symbolic, honorable, and clean. But behind the splendor, France was restless. King's advisors warned of Italy, rich, divided, and vulnerable. Charles saw it as his calling, to march south, claim Naples by inheritance, and bring the Renaissance to France. It was the dream that would define and doom his reign. In 1494, King Charles VIII led 30,000 men across the Alps, the largest army Europe had seen in generations. He claimed the kingdom of Naples through ancestral rights, but in truth, he was chasing a fantasy. Charles envisioned himself a second Charlemagne, uniting Christendom and launching a crusade against the Ottoman Turks. He rode into Italy like a figure from legend, youthful, confident, adored by his troops. Cities surrendered at the mere sight of his banners. Florence opened its gates. Naples fell without a fight. For a brief shining moment, Charles VIII was the master of Italy, but the glory was an illusion. His army, undisciplined and disease-ridden, alienated the very people they came to rule. Reports of looting and cruelty spread quickly. Italy's states, once divided, united against him, forming the League of Venice. At Fornovo, in 1495, Charles barely escaped defeat. He fled back to France with what remained of his army, battered, humiliated, and poorer than before. The Italian dream had turned to ash. When Charles returned home, the glory was gone. He was no longer the shining knight of France, but a man haunted by what could have been. Back at Ambos, the king sought peace in the only place that still felt like home. But peace truly never came. The Italian campaign had drained France's coffers and shaken its confidence. Rumors spread that the king had changed, that he was ill or cursed. Charles suffered from fainting spells, headaches, and trembling fists, what we know now as epileptic seizures. He laughed it off, but courtiers whispered, and tragedy struck once more. Queen Anne had given birth to a daughter, little Anne, but the infant died within days. The queen withdrew into mourning, her chamber draped in black. Charles, desperate to lift her spirits, arranged a simple afternoon diversion, a jeu de paume match, an early form of tennis, played by the courtiers in the lower hall. He wanted the laughter to return to the chateau, if only for a few hours. No one in Ambos could know that by nightfall the laughter would turn into screams. The king was about to walk through a doorway and into history. It was early afternoon when King Charles VIII left his mourning queen's chambers. Outside, spring sunlight glowed across the Loire Valley, the first warm day of the year. The king was cheerful for the first time in weeks. He led the way to the lower courts, when his courtiers had gathered for a match of jeu de paume, the nobleman's tennis. The passage to the court, known as the Haquebec Gallery, was cramped and low, its ceiling barely 6 feet from the ground. It was dark, uneven, and worn smooth by centuries of feet. Charles moved ahead, animated, eager to begin the game. He had struck his head hard on the archway. Those around him gasped, but Charles laughed. He waved them off, insisting he was fine. He continued down the hall, rubbing his forehead. The court erupted in cheers as the match began. No one knew that his fate had already been sealed. At first, the game was lighthearted. Charles smiled, teased his attendants, even applauded good plays. But after a few moments, he began to grow pale. He pressed his hand to his temple. One witness later wrote, quote, "The king seemed suddenly overcome by sleep," end quote. He swayed, tried to speak, and collapsed onto the floor. The crowd froze. The queen screamed. Servants rushed forward, but Charles lay motionless, his body trembling. They carried him from the court through the same corridor where he had shook his head. A straw mat was laid on the cold floor. There, between torches and prayer, the King of France lay dying. Hours passed. He could barely speak, only whispering fragments of prayer. My God, Virgin Mary, Saint Claude, Saint Blaise. At 10 o'clock that night, the king's breathing slowed, then silence. Charles VIII was dead. He was only 27 years old. Queen Anne of Brittany sat alone in her chamber, surrounded by silence. In the span of weeks, she had lost her child and her husband. The palace servants moved quietly, removing banners, extinguishing torches, and draping black cloth across the windows. The court fell into mourning. The news spread quickly through France. The young king, gone without warning, leaving no heir. Charles VIII was the last of his direct line. The House of Valois, which had ruled France for more than 2 centuries, was finished. Within days, his cousin, Louis of Orleans, claimed the throne as Louis XII, and in one of history's cruelest irons, the widow Anne of Brittany, barely 21, was compelled to marry him. The marriage was political, not romantic. It bound Brittany to France forever, uniting the nation, but at the cost of Anne's freedom. How could a simple bump on the head kill a young and healthy king? Doctors at the time had no answer. They spoke vaguely of God's will and weak humors, but modern science offers other theories. Some believe Charles suffered a cerebral hemorrhage, internal bleeding caused by the blow. Others suggest epilepsy, worsened by years of stress and exhaustion. Still others point to an illness already at work, neurosyphilis, a disease common among European courts of the time, slowly eroding the mind and body. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. A single step beneath a stone lintel ended a dynasty. Charles' death seemed almost symbolic, a reminder that even kings are mortal, their crowns fragile as glass. Though Charles' reign was short and his end absurd, his ambitions outlived him. The Italian campaigns he began would shape Europe for decades. France's successors, Louis XII, Francis I, and later monarchs would continue the wars he started, drawn by the same dream of Italian glory. But something unexpected emerged from failure. French soldiers, scholars, and artists returned from Italy, brought with them a new world, ideas, beauty, and humanism. The result was the French Renaissance, the birth of art, agriculture that would redefine France's identity. In a cruel twist of history, the king who died in a corridor became the unintentional spark in textual revolution. Sometimes even tragedy plants the seeds of rebirth. Today, Chateau d'Ambos still stands peaceful, timeless, and heavy with memory. Its stones whisper the same stories they've carried for over 5 centuries. Charles VIII rests in the Basilica of Saint Denis, among France's greatest kings. His reign was short, 15 years, but it bridged the gap between medieval and modern France. He was the last monarch of the old world and the first to glimpse the new. A dreamer, a conqueror, a child of destiny undone by chance. Centuries later, they say the corridors of Ambos still echo at night. The faint rhythm of footsteps, the distant bounce of a ball, and laughter fading into silence. Whether legend or memory, the story of Charles VIII endures, not as a tale of conquest, but of mortality. Even the mightiest crown cannot protect against fate, and in that dim hallway, where one man's laughter turns to eternity, history reminds us that all the world's glory but a shadow of dust.